At this point, you're probably used to me talking about Nintendo all the time, but I actually play a lot more games than just Nintendo games. See, I've played... One of my favorite developers outside of Nintendo is Squareenix. I love the RPG genre, and Squareenix has made so many good RPGs. To this day, they're still some of the best at making those kinds of games. And Squareenix games have inspired some of the best RPGs of all time. In some ways, Nintendo and Squareenix are closely interlinked. They've collaborated on several occasions and inspired each other in so many ways. But at the same time, they've had a very complicated relationship. So let's take a look at how they've worked together over the years. And how they haven't. Now, for those unaware, Squareenix used to be two separate companies, Square and Enix. I don't know how Square got through kindergarten because that's clearly a fucking triangle. But anyways, for this video I'll be talking about the two companies separately up until their merger in 2003. So let's begin. Square was founded in 1983 as a software division of an electric power company. Many of Square's early games were RPGs and text-based adventure games for PC. But in 1985, after Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan, Nintendo and Square struck a deal where Square would produce games exclusively for the Famicom. Enix was founded in 1975 by Yasuhiro Fukushima, though at the time it had nothing to do with video games. Initially, the company was called Eidansha Boshu Service Center, and it published real estate tabloids. However, in 1982, after failing to expand the business nationwide, Fukushima decided that he wanted to make some changes to the company. He changed the name to Enix and started publishing video games. Believe it or not, Enix recruited one of its most important figures through a contest. Enix offered a cash prize to whoever submitted the best game prototype that Enix could publish. The winner ended up being a man named Yuji Horii, who was a writer for a popular manga magazine at the time. The game that Horii submitted was the first game he had ever made. Horii decided that he wanted to keep making games, and Enix continued publishing his games after the contest. In 1983, Horii created a visual novel game called the Portopia Serial Murder Case, which Enix published. The game was very influential because it helped show how video games could tell an engaging story. Several game developers have cited this game as an inspiration, including acclaimed foot fetishist Hideo Kojima, as well as Eiji Aonuma, who's known for his work on the Legend of Zelda series. The Portopia Serial Murder Case was one of the first games that Enix published on the Famicom. It was after this that Horii decided to develop an RPG for the system. A few years later, Enix published that RPG. It was called Dragonquest. Alright, cue the music. Dragonquest became a massively popular franchise in Japan. Ever since it was released in 1986, it's been considered one of the most important RPG video games of all time. And Dragonquest found its roots with Nintendo. The first 6 games in the series launched on Nintendo consoles. On top of that, Nintendo actually published the first Dragon Quest game in North America. This choice was pushed by one Satoru Iwata, who would become the president of Nintendo about a decade later. Oh, and one other thing to note with Dragon Quest is that it helped inspire one of Nintendo's most popular franchises, Pokemon. Dragon Quest V, released in 1992, had a mechanic where you could recruit monsters to your party. Dragon Quest certainly wasn't the first game to have this mechanic, but it was the one that inspired Pokemon's capture mechanic. The game even lets you put your monster party members in storage and switch them out, just like a Pokemon Center. Even the ability to trade Pokemon came from an experience that the creators of Pokemon had while they were playing Dragon Quest II. There's a super rare item in that game called a Mysterious Hat, and when Ken Sugimori and Satoshi Tajiri were playing the game, Sugimori found 2 Mysterious Hats, while Tajiri wasn't able to find any. Tajiri wished there was a way where you could transfer an item from one person's game to another's. Later down the line, Tajiri learned about the Game Boy link cable, which up to that point was used for multiplayer. He remembered his experience with Dragon Quest II and realized that he could use the link cable to transfer things between games. This idea of being able to swap creatures with other players became a core part of the concept for Pokemon. Dragon Quest had a lot of influence on Pokemon. Maybe Enix should sue Nintendo for patent infringement. Anyways, going back to Square, they had started their own popular RPG franchise called Final Fantasy. Actually, it was because Dragonquest was so successful that Square felt they could make their own RPG in a similar vein. Much like Dragonquest, the first 6 Final Fantasy games were released on Nintendo platforms. Nintendo and Square were actually very tight during this time. Nearly all of Square's games up until the mid-90s were released exclusively on Nintendo consoles. Square was essentially a second-party developer for Nintendo, much like HAL Laboratory, the makers of Kirby. However, Square's games weren't finding as much success in America as they had in Japan. Square sought to create a game that would appeal to Western players. At the same time, Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, wanted to make an RPG based on the Mario series. So Nintendo and Square partnered to develop Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. Early in development, Square proposed that Mario would wield a sword, but Miyamoto felt that Mario would look too badass if they did this, so they decided to replace it with a hammer to better suit the Mario style. The main goal the developers had when making this game was to combine the battle mechanics of games like Final Fantasy with the movement mechanics of a Mario game. The main way they did this was by adding action commands to battles. Basically, when the player's attacking or being attacked, they can press the A button to increase the damage they deal or reduce the damage they're dealt. These commands make the game feel more action-oriented, like a Mario game. Super Mario RPG released in 1995 and was a hit. It helped introduce a lot of people to RPGs. It was also a very charming game that still resonates with people to this day. For a long time, Nintendo and Square had a close relationship. Square's games got so popular because they were on Nintendo's consoles. It's kinda hard to imagine where Final Fantasy would be if it had released exclusively on PC or some other console. Square kind of depended on Nintendo, but their relationship was about to change. In 1994, Sony released their first video game console, the PlayStation. Around the same time, Nintendo unveiled their next generation of hardware, the Nintendo 64. The N64 was a very powerful system that could play fully 3D games. By most accounts, the N64 was ahead of the PlayStation, but there was one huge flaw that held the console back. The Nintendo 64 used cartridges instead of discs. The N64's cartridges had several disadvantages to CDs. First, they couldn't store as much data on them, so even though Nintendo 64 games had more advanced graphics, they had to be much smaller than games that were on discs. This severely limited the size of games for the system. Another disadvantage of cartridges is that they're a lot more expensive to produce. A CD can be manufactured and bought in bulk because of how easy and cheap they are to produce. But proprietary cartridges, like the ones that the N64 used, cost a lot more to produce. So in essence, developers would have to make much smaller games for the N64 at a much higher cost. Square was very frustrated by Nintendo's choice to stick with cartridges, especially when the industry was clearly moving towards disc-based games. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was especially upset because he felt he wouldn't be able to make his vision for the next Final Fantasy on the N64. Square tried to convince Nintendo to use discs, but Nintendo refused. As a result, Square decided to stop making games on Nintendo's home consoles. Final Fantasy VII ultimately released on the PlayStation, and went on to become the legendary game that Noah loves. The beef between Nintendo and Square was real though. Nintendo reportedly told Square to quote, "never come back." And Square famously ran this ad railing against the N64 and its cartridges. It's crazy how Final Fantasy used to be a Nintendo exclusive, and Square even helped Nintendo make a Mario game, only for the two companies to hate each other's guts a couple months later. So you're probably wondering how Enix responded to the whole N64 cartridge situation. They actually did release a few games for the N64, but eventually they shifted all their publishing efforts to the PlayStation, like a lot of other third-party publishers. That said, Enix never had a big falling out with Nintendo like Square did. Now, after Square and Enix parted ways with Nintendo, the director of Super Mario RPG, Chihiro Fujioka, left Square and founded a new developer called Alpha Dream. The reason why Alpha Dream is worth mentioning in this video is because they have a lot of connections with both Square and Nintendo. First of all, the name Alpha Dream was chosen because it can also be interpreted as First Dream, which sort of mimics the name Final Fantasy. On top of that, a lot of Alpha Dream's staff were former Square employees. Nintendo decided to partner with this team of former Square employees to make a new game similar to Super Mario RPG. This game would become Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, also known as Mario & Luigi RPG in Japan. Superstar Saga uses a lot of the same concepts and design philosophy that Nintendo and Square laid out. For example, the battle system expands on the action commands that Super Mario RPG introduced. Using a series of action commands, Mario and Luigi can perform special attacks together called Bros attacks. The game also has a large cast of wacky characters, just like Super Mario RPG, and much like Super Mario RPG, Superstar Saga was a big success. Alpha Dream went on to make even more Mario and Luigi games, and worked closely with Nintendo up until their unfortunate bankruptcy in 2019. Now, since Square and Nintendo had broken up, Square started growing very close to Sony. They released almost all of their home console games exclusively for the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 when that came out. As for portable games, Square released some stuff for Bandai's handheld called the Wonder Swan. What I find extremely ironic about this is that Square released games on the Wonder Swan to avoid Nintendo's handhelds. But the Wonder Swan itself was created by one of Nintendo's most important figures, Gunpei Yokoi. You might remember him for, inventing the Game Boy? Although, unlike the Game Boy, the Wonder Swan was kind of a flop, selling only a few million units. Oh, and speaking of flops, in 2001, Square released a Final Fantasy movie called Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. The movie had a huge budget, and Square was really banking on its success. Except, the movie was really bad, and totally bombed at the box office. Hey, wait a minute, Steve Buscemi is in the Final Fantasy movie? I guess I should have been paying more attention to the games. Anyways, the movie lost tens of millions of dollars, and put Square in a tough spot. Square needed to get themselves out of financial hardship, so they decided to give up. Square started releasing games for Nintendo consoles again. Sony, who owned a 19% stake in Square at the time, agreed to let them do this on the condition that they continued making games primarily for the PS2. Still, this marked the point where Nintendo and Square started working together again directly. Enix had also been releasing some games for Nintendo's handhelds. Not before releasing a game for email though, but Enix was having trouble staying afloat, so they decided to try merging with another company. Enix eventually decided that they would merge with Square, who had been one of their biggest competitors over the years. And so, in 2003, the two companies merged their operations, becoming the Square Enix we know today. Nice try guys, but that's definitely a rectangle. After the merger, Square Enix released the first Final Fantasy game for a Nintendo home console since Final Fantasy VI for the SNES. This game was Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles for the GameCube, but Crystal Chronicles was not a mainline Final Fantasy game. Instead, it was a multiplayer spin-off of Final Fantasy. The game has action combat instead of the turn-based combat that was traditional for Final Fantasy up to that point. The game also has a large focus on co-op, which makes it feel a lot less like a typical RPG. Some players were disappointed by how different Crystal Chronicles was from mainline Final Fantasy, but it was still a solid game, and it also served as a symbol of Nintendo and Square Enix's repaired relationship. It was around then that Square Enix started releasing games for Nintendo consoles pretty regularly. They put out a treasure trove of exclusive spin-offs and re-releases, and the DS even got Dragonquest IX as an exclusive. Nintendo may not have been getting the latest mainline Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts games, but Square Enix was still committed to releasing games on Nintendo platforms. Square Enix and Nintendo also did a couple random collaborations around this time. For example, Square Enix developed a couple Mario sports games with Mario Hoops 3-on-3 and Mario Sports Mix. Both games feature Square Enix characters like a Cactuar, a Moogle, and a Slime. Hey look, the gang's all here. You can also play as a white mage, whose design looks vaguely similar to Peach and Rosalina. Square Enix and Nintendo also collaborated on the Itadaki Street games. Itadaki Street is a series of party games that Yuji Horii had been making ever since the Famicom. The games have very similar rules to Monopoly, although they do have their own mechanics that make them more complex than Monopoly at times. When Square Enix was making Itadaki Street for the DS, Nintendo agreed to let them make the game a crossover between Super Mario and Dragonquest. Nintendo agreed to do this again for the Wii entry, and even went as far as to publish the game worldwide. It's actually one of the only Itadaki Street games to be released outside of Japan. You might know this game as Fortune Street. It was nice to get these fun little crossovers between Nintendo and Square Enix characters, and overall, it seemed like the two companies were getting along again. After having a very successful console generation with the Wii, Nintendo released their next home console, the Wii U, and Square Enix released almost nothing for it. But that's okay, nobody else did either. The Wii U sold very poorly, and because of that, a lot of third-party developers thought it was a waste of time and money to develop games for a failing console. Square Enix was one of those developers, but even though they weren't supporting the Wii U, they kept releasing games on the 3DS like nothing was wrong. I guess Square Enix wasn't that offended by the Wii U being shitty. Honestly, the biggest support that Square gave the Wii U was adding Cloud to Smash for Wii U and 3DS. But even then, the DLC pack for Cloud was really bare bones. It had only 2 music tracks and a very small selection of trophies. It felt like Square Enix was very hesitant to include a character in Smash. On the other hand, Nintendo was really struggling because of the Wii U's failure. The 3DS may have been doing well, but the Wii U had very little coming out, because most third-party developers had abandoned the console. Nintendo realized that they needed to get a new console out quick. So in 2017, less than 5 years after the Wii U had come out, Nintendo released their next console, the Nintendo Switch. As we all know, the Switch is a hybrid between a handheld console and a home console. It was a really unique concept at the time, but sadly, the Switch was a failure, just like the Wii U. Just kidding, it was the most successful Nintendo console ever. Suddenly, all the developers that ditched the Wii U wanted to get a piece of the Switch pie. Square Enix was very on board with the Switch. Before the console had even come out, Square had started developing a new RPG to launch exclusively for the Switch. At the time, it was known as Project Octopath Traveler. This game would become Octopath Traveler. Wow, nice job thinking of a better title, guys. In addition to supporting the Switch with new games, Square started re-releasing a lot of their classic games. This meant that some of Square Enix's best games were now available on a Nintendo console for the first time. Oh yeah, and in an absolutely insane turn of events, Final Fantasy VII, the game that Square infamously couldn't put on a cartridge, was now available on a cartridge. If I showed this to Square in the 90s, they would have a panic attack. One thing I have to note here is that if Square Enix had never re-released a lot of their classic games, then I probably wouldn't have played Final Fantasy VII, and I probably wouldn't have gotten as into Square Enix games in the first place. Having these games on the Switch has really helped me get into the Final Fantasy series and RPGs in general, and I know there's a lot of other people who've had the same experience. I think it just goes to show how valuable it is to re-release games for a new generation. On that note, Nintendo got to re-release a very special game on the Switch. With Square Enix's blessing, Nintendo released a remake of Super Mario RPG. The remake is extremely faithful to the original game. So many little details are left intact from the SNES version. Hey, they even kept the little Magitech armor. By and large, this is the same game that Square Enix and Nintendo created almost 30 years prior. The Switch has a bunch of Mario RPGs, so it's nice that players can go back to Super Mario RPG and see where all these games got their roots. Oh, and speaking of Mario RPGs, in 2024, Nintendo revived the Mario and Luigi series with Mario and Luigi Brothership. As I mentioned, Alpha Dream went bankrupt in 2019, so who did Nintendo get to develop Brothership? Well, Nintendo got a developer called Acquire to make the game. Acquire most notably helped Square Enix make Octopath Traveler and Octopath Traveler 2. You see how this story comes full circle? For the most part though, the Switch was a very successful console generation for both Nintendo and Square Enix, but it wasn't perfect. See, even though Square had released a lot of games for the Switch, there were some games that Square had developed for other platforms that just couldn't make it to the Switch. Games like FF7 Remake and Kingdom Hearts 3 were just too graphically demanding. Square Enix wanted to find a way to bring these more demanding games to the Switch, so they decided to release cloud versions of the Kingdom Hearts games for Switch. But the problem with cloud games is that they aren't actually running on the console you're playing them on. They're being streamed to your console via the internet. And because of that, cloud games don't always run well, and on top of that, they require a constant internet connection, which kind of defeats the portability of the Switch. These cloud versions were pretty poorly received, so Square Enix gave up on the idea. Some games just weren't going to work on the Nintendo console. That was until 2025, when Nintendo released the Nintendo Switch 2. At its core, the Switch 2 is a much more powerful Switch. Its hardware is a lot closer to current-gen consoles, and it can play much more demanding games as a result. This opened the door for so many games that couldn't work on the Switch 1 to be brought to the Switch 2. Square Enix has been very supportive of the Switch 2, perhaps even more supportive than they were with the Switch 1. Part of the reason for this is because Square Enix has been struggling financially. They lost nearly $140 million on games that they had to cancel or shut down shortly after launch. What's more is that some of Square Enix's big-budget AAA games like FF7 Rebirth and FF16 had much lower sales than anticipated. To try and recover from these financial problems, Square Enix is focused on bringing their games to as many platforms as possible. That's why Square Enix has released almost all of their new games on the Switch 2 since the console launched. But the Switch 2 has a problem that might diminish Square Enix's strategy here, and maybe even damage their relationship with Nintendo. The problem with the Switch 2 is it uses cartridges. Sound familiar? Yeah, much like the cartridges of the N64, Switch 2 cartridges have a limited amount of storage and are expensive to produce. However, Nintendo did devise a workaround for this with game keycards. Isn't it impressive how I can find a way to complain about game keycards no matter the subject? To sum it up briefly, game keycards are empty cartridges that you insert into your Switch 2 so that you can download a game digitally over the internet. A lot of people do not like game keycards, and there's been a huge outcry on the internet about them. This isn't a good sign for Square Enix because every single game they're releasing on the Switch 2 is a game keycard. All those games I showed earlier? Yeah, they're all going to be on game keycards. It's not clear how game keycards have actually affected sales, but if people truly don't like game keycards, then Square Enix's games might not sell well on the Switch 2. And that's not good, considering how Square Enix derives a lot of its sales from Nintendo platforms. If sales slow down because of game keycards, then that's going to hurt Square Enix's multi-platform strategy. And if that's the case, then Square Enix may lose interest in working with Nintendo. Okay, there are a lot of ifs in that situation. Maybe people aren't bothered by game keycards. Maybe people will buy games digitally instead. Maybe Noah's the only one who gives a shit. I don't know. But at the very least, it's interesting how this game keycard situation kind of reflects what happened with the N64 and its cartridges. We'll just have to wait and see what happens with this game keycard situation. Will there be another falling out between Square Enix and Nintendo? Or will Square Enix help find the solution to physical games on the Switch 2? Considering how much they need their games to succeed on Switch 2, I could definitely see them being the ones to push more for physical games. Who knows? But for now, Nintendo and Square Enix are on good terms. I know this video definitely came off as me glazing the hell out of Nintendo and Square Enix, maybe Noah's a corporate shill after all. But I just thought it would be interesting to take a look at the times that my favorite game companies work together. Now, before I close out this video, I want to give a special thanks to Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, because if it didn't flop, we wouldn't have Final Fantasy on the Switch. Thanks for being a shitty movie.